So what I wanted to do just right off the bat here, there we go, is talk about just really quickly the end-to-end architecture and just give it a quick summary. Now I'm getting OCD about the camera. Just so everyone's up to speed with what it looks like. So let's get started with that. So this is sort of a rough idea. So we have a view, a presenter, which I now call logic. We have a view model, oops, wrong side. So that's going to be front-end persistence. There's a use case or interactor, whatever you want to call it, I don't really care. And these are just representative backend services. So that's the basic structure. Is basically, if I were to use terms which are familiar to most people, it basically looks like model view presenter plus a view model for front-end data storage. And I'll show you really quickly how I propagate events and stuff like that, and then we'll get to some live coding. Let's go to note list view, and we'll start here. So Naline mentions, says, I'd like to try your architecture for my next big project. I am honored to hear that, but you know, don't necessarily assume that what I would suggest to you is also feel free to, like, if you want to experiment and do something different, certainly give it a shot. Because I don't, that's basically how I learn architecture, is I tried a whole bunch of different styles and saw what I like. So anyways, glad to hear that. So we have our view. So this is just unequivocally a view class. It shouldn't be really, I'll address that MVVM comment in a moment. So this is just a view, very simple. I keep my views very dumb, or I follow what is kind of referred to as a subset of model view presenter, or a style of that called passive view, or I think maybe humble view is another name, although that could be pointing to some other concept. But the basic gist of it is I don't want logic in my views. Now obviously, yeah, I'm calling a series of commands in the view, and so this is a place where I have to be especially careful about what's going on. But this is the kind of thing that I would test basically by using the application. You could also test it using Espresso, but you know, I have a limited patience for, I already spend a lot of time writing unit tests, so that's one thing I'm just not super into at the moment. And then another thing, currently we do start activities through the fragment. I would like to change that and have some external class manage the changes between activities, but I don't think it will be through the navigation from Android Jetpack, because I don't like that it basically creates my fragments for me. I can't really have that the way this application is built. But I do want some external object, and you know, whether I use Google's implementation of it or I use my own, you know, it's not a big deal. Either way, I'll learn. And then of course we have, so we talk to the logic class and through the view. Now one of the things I wanted to avoid is I didn't want the view to have a whole bunch of different methods to call on the logic class. Instead, I kind of wanted to represent these potential actions in the view through what I call just events, different events. So you'll notice whenever I actually tell the view about something, other than there's two exceptions. There's logic.clear and logic.bind. Those are the two exceptions. But in terms of user interface events, I have this thing called note list event, and then it has a subset of events. So let me jump into that and we'll see what that looks like. Let's go to the contract. So I note list contract, there we go. So notice in these contract classes, I have basically interfaces for all of the different things that I would like to represent. Let me zoom in a little so that's clear. And then in the bottom, because Kotlin is amazing, I can just slap in a sealed class down here, And this sealed class basically represents every potential event which can propagate from the view. Now, most of the time I'm really just saying to the logic class, hey, something's going on. A new node has been clicked, login has been clicked, whatever. In this particular case, I need an actual position, but this thing here does not get called by the view. That gets called by the adapter, which also is capable of contacting or talking to the logic class through an interface. That was a kind of a challenge, actually decoupling the view from the adapter and then making sure that everything still coordinates and works properly. Because the unfortunate thing about recycler view adapters is that they are inherently tightly coupled to the view and tightly coupled to Android. So that was, it takes some logical progression to get those things to wire together nicely. But this is just a basic recycler view list adapter. So nothing really special going on here. So back to note list logic. So how this class works is it's basically like the logic center of the front end of the application. So it coordinates a view model. This view model exists here so that this logic class does not need to store state, and the view does not need to store state. And when I mean state, I'm referring specifically to front end session state. So the kind of thing that is not relevant necessarily to the back end, it's more relevant to the front end, like it has an effect on the user interface and needs to be persisted. In that case, I have my special little front end data container, which is a view model. I'll jump into that really quickly. It's just a very simple, it's about what you would assume a view model would look like, as I like to say. It doesn't make decisions, it stores basically the model of the view. So it's not coordinating anything. Anyways, really quickly, so the list, the logic classes, what they do is they coordinate the front end, and they will also ask the back end, or the middleware class, that's going to get tricky to explain, for whatever data it requires. So in this case, we have three different data sources here. We have a private note source, so that's when the user is not in public mode, and we have a public note source, which is when the user is in public mode. I'll explain that later. We haven't implemented yet. Then we have an auth source, which is where I will be basically authenticating the user. Now, when I say private note source, it's important to recognize that the private note source both has a local and a remote repository, whereas the public note source will only have a remote repository. So, anyways, carrying on. All right. So how this basically works is the view will note list. Sorry, my neighbors are making a bunch of noise outside. How this will basically work is the come on, brain, you can do this. So we will call some event on the logic class. So I'm in view. So let's say, where do I register the events? What events do we have here? Okay, here we go. Yeah, whatever. So when onStart is called, we're ready to start grabbing the data from the data source. So I call noteListEvent.onStart, which of course comes from here in iNoteListContract. Then we hop into the logic view, and then I have this kind of like there's probably a name for this thing I have here. I'm not aware of what it is, but I think this is a pattern. So I have an event which is capable of, I think it might be the command pattern or the strategy pattern, one of those two. Anyways, I'll talk about that in a moment, Taha, but that's an interesting question. Anyways, so I basically delegate to some method in the logic class based on this event. And why this is really nice, why I really like this pattern, is when I get into the test class, so note list logic test, then basically all I want to do is I'll generate some event object. So for example, on start, I'll specify whatever details about it I want to specify. So in this case, we call on start with an empty list. We call on start with data, a test note list. And then so that allows me to kind of test each of these events and really get good code coverage, because what am I testing in my unit tests? I just make sure that all of these are covered properly. So I'm not sure if I have 100% of them, but I've got most of them in my test class, as you can see here. So once it's time to say talk to the backend database, what we do is we say, what's a good example? So let's go back to on start. So we call on start, which is down here. I make sure that my job tracker object is present. This is very similar, let's say similar to composite disposable from RxJava 2. If you're familiar with RxJava 2, this is a very similar principle here, this job tracker. I can clear it to tear things down. So we get that going, and then we call getListData. And so this is when we're going to get the data from the appropriate data source. So if the user is in private mode, we'll do the private list data. If the user's, let me zoom in. If the user is in public mode, we'll get the public data. For now, I haven't implemented public data, so we won't even worry about that. So because coroutines are fricking amazing, and this is like one of the biggest reasons why I think you should switch to Kotlin, or sorry, I think you should consider switching to Kotlin, is coroutines are amazing. They allow you to write asynchronous code in a what's called direct style, or a sort of sequential style, sequential blocking style, even though the code is not blocking the main thread. And so I just ask the data source for the data I want, and then I check. This will happen asynchronously. You can see there's a suspension point here. So this will suspend this function until, in this case, the private data is loaded, the data result is assigned. Then we check what happened. So sometimes the backend might throw an error. I haven't implemented that yet, but we check for that case, and then we do things appropriately. So when it's time to render the view, just this morning I added in a special little, just a bit of logic here. So if the result is empty, I show an empty state, which is where you saw the empty state with the loading, the satellite image loading. So I'll tell it to do that. Otherwise, I'll tell it to show the list. I still submit the list to the adapter because if the users, I'm not sure if this is what I want to do yet, but the user is going to be able to switch between private and public mode in the list activity. So I think I'm going to want to reuse the same instance of the adapter, and I do have it configured with a diff util, but I haven't actually tested this out, so I'm not saying this is actually implemented properly, but eventually. Diff util is kind of how you figure out, it helps your recycler view change when the data set changes, in simple terms. So that's basically it. All I really want to talk about for logic. Let's hop into just public or private data source, rather, private node source. So I was working with channels and with the channel coroutine, and one of the problems I was running into is so in order to access data from room, I had to switch threads. So you'll notice I say async dispatchers.io, because if I didn't do that, then if I hop into local here, that's going to be called local, room note database simple. Anyways, moving on. So what I was saying before is that I was trying to call note.DAO.getNoteById or whatever. I was just trying to talk to the room database. And I was getting this error, which the error was basically you can't access room on the main thread. So in many cases with coroutines, you don't actually need to switch threads, but in some cases you do. And so what I did is I couldn't get it to work properly with channels. I couldn't get it to necessarily call back to the main thread properly. Maybe there's a way. I couldn't get it to work, but I did manage to get it working with using async, and so I'm not necessarily that upset about not being able to use channels here. But I do want to explore channels and actors a little better. Yeah, that's the basic gist of it. So we ask the local data source for the data, and currently I do ask the remote for data, but I don't do anything with it because I haven't configured it 100%. Just to show you really quickly what remote looks like. So that'll be Firebase. It's not really implemented yet, but it'll just be another data source, and it'll talk to Firebase database. I've got it partially implemented, but I still need to do a lot of configuration there. So eventually what will happen is we will basically, I'll have to write logic to basically coordinate which data to prioritize, when to like request more data from remote, and those kinds of things. So that's been something I've been talking about and trying to do for a while. And so hopefully I'll be able to get to that soon. It's been taking a while because I've been busy with a lot of other stuff, but we're getting there. Anyways, I feel like I might have to sneeze in a moment. Apologies if I do. Okay, so that's pretty much the end-to-end architecture. One final note, as opposed to giving my interactor or use case or whatever you want to call it, as opposed to holding reference to local and remote in this class itself, I actually just always, I'm basically trying to take a more functional approach, which is to basically give a function everything it needs and avoid shared mutable state. And so that's kind of the reason why I'm doing that. If you have questions about Android, Kotlin, software architecture, or just programming in general, then leave me a question down below and I might just get back to you in the next video. If you enjoyed this content, do me a favor and hit the like button down below. Consider subscribing, following me on your preferred social media platforms, and even throwing me a couple bucks on PayPal or Patreon. Links in the description box below. Thanks for watching, and peace out.